Hello, we welcome you back to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix podcast. Today again with your hosts, myself, Bernhard Gunther, and my wife, Laura Matsu. And today's episode is about the shadow of enlightenment, confronting spiritual narcissism. There is a version of spiritual awakening that looks like the real thing, can be the real thing. It speaks the language. It has the appearance of it, so to speak. It can move people, it can inspire people, even heal people. Yet underneath, something doesn't fit right and has gone terribly wrong, so to speak. And that's what we are exploring today. Narcissism and its spiritual counterpart, spiritual narcissism. When the ego hijacks the path and uses the spiritual journey to do what the wounded ego has always done, to seek power, avoid pain, and especially feeling better or superior to others. We're calling this spiritual narcissism. But before we can talk about what it looks like, especially in today's spiritual culture and so forth, we need to understand what we're actually dealing with on a psychological level. We're not just talking about arrogance, right? Or how easily the label narcissism is being used these days without people really understanding what it entails. And most importantly, to spot it also within ourselves, as everyone has narcissistic attributes on different levels. In short, this podcast isn't just about your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, whom you may call narcissistic and so forth. It's about confronting a wound that lives in all of us. A universal human vulnerability that, left unconscious, can corrupt even the most sincere spiritual seeking. So, in this first hour, we're going to build the foundation. We're going to look at what narcissism actually is at a psychological level and psychological reality to understand within ourselves. We will look at healthy narcissism, what a healthy ego actually looks like, and how the false self forms and how then grandiosity operates or develops. And then we go deeper into in-depth psychology through the work of Robert Moore to show a deeper level narcissism. What happens when the personal self gets possessed by an archetypal force that he called the dragon or the Luciferic complex. That's the spiritual ego or spiritual narcissism, which we then dive deeper in this second hour. For our members, as always, again, if you're not a member of our podcast yet, you can always sign up at veilofreality.com/membership. So, in a nutshell, very important to understand that this conversation is not about finger pointing and to blame others. That is very key. It's an opportunity for honest self-reflection, because the moment you decide that this is only about someone else, the dragon has already won, and you're caught in the web of grandiosity and project your own unconscious narcissism onto others. And before we now start diving deeper into all of this, a very quick announcement. Our 14-week group coaching program, Time of Transition Embodied Soul Awakening, that starts March 18th until June 21st, has filled up. So we have stopped enrollment. However, if you're interested to join a future round, which we will then announce at some point, you can go to the website thetimeoftransition.com and sign up to the waiting list there. And you can also read all the information about the program, frequently answered questions, and anything else there. Much more information about the program on that website. So go to thetimeoftransition.com and sign up to the waiting list there. Okay, so let's start with understanding narcissism. Because before we get into spiritual narcissism, obviously we need to understand what narcissism is in a basic psychological way. It's very important to get into this with the context of self-reflection, because as therapist Terry Real pointed out, we also have our own subtle ways in which narcissistic traits like grandiosity creep into our lives. So the moment you think you're above it or you have no narcissistic traits, you're relegated to the shadow, which only makes it even more powerful. First of all, we want to be very clear. There are narcissistic defense mechanisms, there are narcissistic personality styles, and there's narcissistic personality disorders. So narcissism operates on a spectrum of intensity. So in this first part, we will lay the foundation by looking at healthy narcissism, narcissistic pathology, the false self, developmental trauma, how it relates to what is called inflation, and the archetypal dimension of grandiosity. Then we will bridge narcissism with the spiritual realm, and where narcissism becomes more subtle and more dangerous actually, and creates spiritualized narcissism. Now, it is important to begin by reclaiming something that is often very misunderstood. There's such thing as healthy narcissism, which is a necessary part of psychological development. Healthy narcissism basically means healthy self-esteem, healthy self-worth, and a stable sense of self with healthy self-confidence and a capacity to feel good about oneself without tipping into grandiosity or superiority. So this healthy narcissism includes the ability to tolerate criticism without collapsing or feeling bad about yourself, without becoming defensive, but also to set boundaries, to be authentic, and to be in a mutual relationship where there's empathy and interest in the other person as well, rather than the need to constantly seek admiration or control or acknowledgement or attention from somebody else. Carl Jung was also very clear that without a healthy ego, there's no real individuation. It is called the I, which is the stable center within yourself and which you need to build to contact the greater self. So many spiritual teachings focus on dissolving the ego too early, which can actually become dangerous because without sufficient ego development, we may think that we have transcended when we're actually spiritually bypassing, dissociating, or the risk of becoming inflated. Even Sri Aurobindo in his work of the Integral Yoga said before an adept or a sadhak can engage into deeper spiritual work in the Integral Yoga, he has to develop a healthy sense of self, ego consciousness first. Sounds like a contradiction, but if we don't do this, we easily fall into spiritual bypassing. So what are the traits of a healthy ego? It's the ability to feel confident in your ability to deal with everyday life's challenges. It's the ability to perceive reality with accuracy, to not have it be overly distorted with your own projections, meaning you need to be aware of your projections. It's the ability to accept limitations in life, including your own. It's the ability to observe oneself, examine one's shadow, pain, and the openness to psychological insight, even, and that's very important, even if it reveals painful and difficult truths about oneself or reality. It's not about needing to see oneself as purely good or accepting your aggressive, selfish, negative traits and not purely projecting evil onto others. So it's not this black and white thing. A high amount of emotional intelligence is also the reflection of a healthy ego, so to speak, or healthy narcissism, and the ability to successfully regulate your emotions even in difficult times. It's a sense of security where you feel you can cope and handle problems in everyday life without losing your sense of self. Ultimately, it's the ability to be resilient in the face of life's difficulties, seeing this as challenges to be mastered and overcome. It's also the ability to pick yourself back up after difficult events and so dust yourself off, so to speak, and move forward with healthy optimism. So healthy egos mostly strongly reveal themselves also in relationships. It shows itself in the ability to have empathy, the capacity for genuine interest and dialogue with a person, and not being primarily defensive or reactive, right? So it's also ultimately about getting them out of the victim blame trap, right? Where you also have more humility, take responsibility, and don't just blame the world and others for anything. In short, someone with a healthy ego is grounded in reality, self-aware, capable of accepting their shadow. He or she is humble, but also with self-esteem and is able to relate to others authentically.
So you can see that having a healthy ego is necessary and even a byproduct of engaging in your own healing work, especially looking at your family of origin, your own childhood wounds. You develop a healthy I as a product of either having a happy, healthy childhood, which many of us didn't, or working on those wounds. So this is why Jung was very he stressed and emphasized that you needed to have a healthy ego before going into depth psychology, into the individuation process. He really stressed it was important and essential because without that healthy ego and without that healthy sense of self, you cannot merge with the transpersonal energies without losing yourself and potentially becoming inflated in the process.
That's a very good point. He also said you not even be able to fully engage in shadow work with a somewhat healthy ego.
Exactly.
Right. So let's look a bit then. We looked at the attributes of a healthy ego. Let's look a little bit about what a fragile or weak ego would look like. You know, that's someone who sees challenges as something to avoid or complain about all the time. A fragile ego struggles in the face of problems and tries to avoid them through denial, fantasy, or even substance abuse, addiction, distraction, all of that. A lack of psychological resilience and difficulty regulating emotions. They are highly susceptible to the moods of others and opinions. They have poor boundaries in general, right? They don't want to be around, bad vibes and all of this. They constantly seek external validation, or they suffer from chronic self-doubt. A very weak ego avoids inner work because it lacks the stable sense of self to confront the pain or the shadow without dissociating or disintegrating and collapsing. And a weak, fragile ego also usually engages in excessive projection, constantly putting down others as a way, or blaming others as a way to feel superior to them. So, as we just saw, fragile or weak egos are very easily subject to inflation. This is when the ego identifies with something larger than itself and mistakes these transpersonal energies for its personal greatness. For example, I am special and superior, or I am the source of this power, or I have a unique truth that others don't. So the core characteristics of an inflated ego is ultimately this grandiosity. It's about feeling special, feeling chosen or superior. It's about seeing oneself as spiritually advanced and having unique insight that makes one superior to others. It's about presenting oneself as a guru, prophet, or, the divine masculine or feminine, as a queen or king, as people very easily identify nowadays with this very distorted divine masculine, feminine, quote-unquote teachings, identifying as a savior, messiah, or Jung called this identifying with the archetype, which is very, very dangerous. It's the inability actually to see one's shadow or one's own personal flaws while projecting it continuously onto others. It's also, this grandiosity shows off in moral certainty and superiority, right? Black and white thinking, being ideologically possessed and rigid, whatever left and right political spectrum. It's about fusing the ego with the superego, right? The voice of the conscience. And there's lack of psychological humility, right? You feel like you're all just, you're all virtuous, you're all moral and good, and the evil and the bad people are all out there, for example. That's a sign of grandiosity. And ultimately, it obviously then relates to spiritual bypassing and using spiritual language to prop yourself up and defend yourself.
All right. So now let's get into narcissistic traits versus narcissistic personality disorder. I think this is a very important distinction that matters a lot because I think lately we all seem to throw around the word narcissistic NPD far too casually. And I'm going to say something confronting, that we all have narcissistic traits to some degree, and they can either be conscious or unconscious, and these traits can operate on a healthy spectrum or on a healthy spectrum, like Bernhard said earlier. And there's also a difference between narcissistic defense mechanisms, which means narcissistic traits that come up when someone is dealing with something difficult. There's narcissistic personality styles, and then there's the full-blown personality disorder, which, according to psychoanalyst Jonathan Shedler, is actually much more rare. Because narcissistic personality disorder is severe, and it has its own spectrum of severity within that. It involves chronic entitlement, lack of empathy, exploitation of others, grandiosity, the inability to self-reflect, and usually behind that superiority, there's a fragile, wounded self hidden behind it. So Jonathan Shedler, a psychologist who studies this and writes about this, writes, in Kernberg's object relations model, pathological narcissism, malignant narcissism, and psychopathy form a continuum. Pathological narcissism rests on the defense of splitting. This is when the person identifies with the good parts of the self and projects the bad parts onto others. In this way, they maintain a perception of self as good and righteous while seeing others as bad and inferior. In malignant narcissism, the projected badness is then infused with hate and aggression. Others are not just seen as lesser, but will be treated in cruel, exploitive, and hateful ways, even as the person continues to see themselves as good and righteous. In psychopathy, relations with others are completely dominated by hate and aggression. Others are seen solely as objects to be exploited or toyed with sadistically for pleasure. So basically, the level of hate and aggression determines the location on the continuum, from narcissism to malignant narcissism to psychopathy, Where there is capacity for genuine human connection, attachment, caring, intimacy, love, the person is primarily on the narcissistic end of the continuum and treatment is possible. Where aggression and hate are prominent, it's malignant narcissism. Malignant narcissism is narcissism infused with aggression and hate. This may or may not be treatable depending on the level of hate and aggression in the mix. When aggression and hate dominate and the capacity for attachment is absent, it's psychopathy and it's untreatable. Because a lot of people out there, and Terry Real would disagree with this, say, oh, sorry, the after untreatable was the end of his quote. So again, a lot of people out there, and I see a lot of people say narcissism personality disorder is completely untreatable. And actually, Terry Real will challenge this. He says it is difficult to work with, but it can be worked with. It's more the malignant narcissism and the psychopathy that's untreatable, according to Shedler. And a key point from Shedler is that a narcissistic personality style becomes problematic only when it interferes with relationships and emotional functioning. So he describes pathological narcissism very differently from the stereotype of someone just being arrogant or full of themselves. He emphasizes it rests on a core psychological contradiction, which is at the center of narcissistic pathology. It's grandiosity on the surface, while underneath there's deep feelings of inadequacy, emptiness, or shame. So this grandiosity, this false self that they build, functions as a defense against that vulnerability. And in Shedler's description, people with this narcissistic personality disorder tend to show a few key patterns. One, fragile self-esteem, which means that even though they may appear self-confident on the outside, it's unstable. They are extremely sensitive to rejection, perceived disrespect, criticism. Two, there's also a chronic need for admiration. So their self-esteem is constantly maintained through praise, status, recognition, admiration. And without it, they may feel just empty, or the shame may creep in. Three, they tend to have difficulty with genuine intimacy because relationships, healthy ones, or their relationships rather, are organized around validation, status, admiration. So they see other people as ways to regulate their self-esteem rather than separate individuals. They aren't actually interested in your inner life. They aren't actually interested in your feelings, but they can perform it. They can learn to perform that. But you'll see that many ways it just brings, the conversation will always come back to themselves. Shame and humiliation is another key trait. So the key dynamic in narcissistic pathology is that internally they feel intense shame. So when they feel criticized or exposed, they often respond with what we call narcissistic rage, contempt, devaluation of others, finding a ways to put others down constantly. And then emotional emptiness. Many narcissistic patients describe that they're chronically bored, that they feel empty inside. They might have a lack of meaning, and the grandiosity functions to cover this. And Shedler's key distinction is that the difference is not how confident someone appears. The real difference is how the personality is organized internally and relationally. So narcissistic traits include stable self-esteem, being ambitious without exploiting others, the ability to love and empathize others, the capacity to accept criticism. That's healthy narcissistic traits. And then we have the narcissistic personality disorder, which is unstable self-esteem. So they either feel on top of the world or they feel empty, depending on what attention they're getting or what validation they're getting. There's a constant need for admiration. Their relationships are organized around who can validate me, who can make me feel superior to others, and underlying shame and emptiness. So at the core of narcissism is a false self. And this is where the work of D.W. Winnicott and Heinz Kohut are useful. So the narcissistic person develops a false self, which is an outer identity designed to protect this wounded inner core. So in that core, there's shame, emptiness, insecurity, and deep unmet attachment needs. But the outer image that they present to the world is something that they've constructed to secure admiration, to gain validation, and protect that true core from being exposed, which honestly is why it can be hard to just diagnose people based on what you see on social media, because you don't know what that inner core is until you really get to know them and you really start to witness them in relationship. But this is actually why criticism to them, it feels annihilating, because Their entire defensive structure rests on getting admiration, getting validation. It becomes food they need to survive. And then criticism threatens that very structure itself.
Okay, so with that understanding and foundation, let's look more into how narcissists are made, so to speak. Now, narcissism develops through, as Laura just hinted at, distorted attachment and failures of mirroring. There are two common pathways, or the most common pathways are emotional neglect and over-idealization. In emotional neglect, that means the child's feelings and inner reality are ignored or were ignored and invalidated. So a compensatory grandiose identity forms to survive, just as Laura just described. In over-idealization, is almost the other extreme. The child is treated as unusually special or superior, the golden child, and the identity becomes inflated without any humility. But a stable inner self does not fully develop as a result of that, and instead a defense image self forms around performance, admiration, and control. So let's look at those two different ones. So emotional neglect, that means when feelings are ignored or invalidated, the child then builds a grandiose identity to survive, to override the pain, so to speak. With over-idealization, the child is treated as a special or superior, and then this identity becomes inflated. So the key development issues here are a lack of object constancy, as it's called, which means the ability to retain a stable emotional connection with a person, even when they are not present, or you're frustrated with them, or there's a conflict.
So a good example of this is what they would call psychologically the borderline patient, right? So you're either the best person in the world or you're the worst person in the world. So borderline people have difficulty retaining a stable idea of someone or healthy relationship with someone in the face of conflict. So you see this lack of object constancy is either all good or all bad. And you can't be like, okay, I'm frustrated with this person, but I still love them.
Yeah. So that extreme black and white view of the world as well. Now, other key development issues also obviously then lack of emotional attunement, unstable attachment, and shame regulation problems when we're just caught in, internalized shame, toxic shame. We had an episode about that as well. So how does the narcissistic personality pattern develop? These patterns develop through interactions between basically a person's temperament and what happened in their relationships and how they were shaped by developmental experiences, which makes it unique to each person. Right? Psychodynamic theory here in this case emphasizes the importance of empathic attunement and mirroring in early development. Very important. So when caregivers and parents consistently recognize and respond to a child's inner emotional world, the child gradually develops stable and creates a cohesive sense of self, healthy self. When this process is disrupted, on the other hand, this development of self-esteem and identity can become unstable. So two relational dynamics often discussed that can create narcissism is, number one, emotional neglect, like we said, and number two, over-idealization. Now, this does not mean that if this occurs, narcissism will always be created, but there are common patterns that can contribute to narcissistic personality organization and all that. So let's look specifically at emotional neglect. When a child's emotional experiences are frequently ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood, the child may struggle to develop a secure sense of being seen and valued. And the effects that come from it can include difficulty forming a stable sense of self, a heightened sensitivity to shame or rejection, and growing reliance on external validation to regulate self-esteem. So in response, the person may then develop strategies to stabilize this self-worth through seeking achievement, admiration, status, and life becomes a performance way into adulthood. And these strategies basically help to protect against feelings of inadequacy.
So right off the bat, you can see, if you're like me and you grew up with some form of emotional neglect, that it will create a tendency to not have a stable sense of self-esteem, a sensitivity to the opinions of others, and then reliant on the opinions of others in order to regulate self-esteem. So again, bringing back to the important first point is you can see how easily childhood wounds can create narcissistic defenses. It doesn't mean that you have like a personality disorder, doesn't mean you completely lack empathy and you're exploitive of others or you're a malignant narcissist. But I think this is a really important point because there's so many people who were emotionally neglected, who were loved for how they performed or what they did rather than who they are. So we all have these narcissistic defenses that can come up in relationship that need to be worked on and reparented. And the best way to do it is to actually witness yourself in relationship.
That also, this emotional neglect, I would say, also ties into what is called narcissistic wounding. Not only were we not mirrored emotionally and neglected emotionally, but on top of it, one parent or both parents were trying to get their emotional needs met through the child.
Yes.
Like narcissistic.
Which is the enmeshment, I think we bring in later. Yes, exactly.
Okay, now that's emotional neglect. The other extreme is over-idealization. As we just said, then in some families, the child may be excessively praised or treated as unusually special or exceptional. So if admiration is not balanced with realistic feedback in emotional attunement with the inner world, the child may have difficulty developing the ability to be realistic in how they appraise oneself, both strengths and weaknesses. They may have low tolerance for limitations, and they do not develop a sense of stable self-esteem, which is independent of any praise. So, which means their sense of self is organized around maintaining an idealized image of themselves, rather than developing a secure, whole, and integrated and realistic sense of self. Also, and we have explored this in the past podcast as well, when we talked about toxic shame, because narcissistic personality also can be created as a defense against shame, unconscious shame. Now, from a psychodynamic perspective, it can be also understood as a defense adaptation to protect a vulnerable sense of self. And these passive development influences include emotional neglect, again, humiliation or chronic criticism, inconsistent parenting, parental narcissism. We just mentioned when the parents project their emotional needs onto the child, which is also enmeshment, and conditional love tied to achievement. Now, over time, this person will then internalize a belief such as that their value, their sense of self-value, depends on how well I perform or how others see me. And again, to protect against painful feelings such as shame and inadequacy, the personality then develops certain strategies designed to maintain self-esteem, like constant striving for admiration or status, success, maintaining an image of superiority, avoiding situations that could expose vulnerability, and a constant need to devaluing others to gain self-esteem in order to put others down to make oneself feel better. Right? All of this is part of our culture. It's very common nowadays, has almost become normalized. Now, this defensive structure then functions as a protection against deep feelings of shame and worthlessness.
Okay, so now let's go into the two main expressions of narcissism. Perhaps some of you have heard of this because narcissism isn't always this grandiose narcissism of like this kind of Leo archetype of like, look at me and attention seeking. There's also vulnerable and fragile narcissism, but they're both organized around the same underlying issue, unstable self-esteem and difficulty regulating shame, but they both appear very different outwardly. So grandiose narcissism is a version that most people will recognize. That's that trait of being superior to others with this sense of outward confidence, entitlement. There's a deep desire for admiration, dismissiveness towards criticism, always self-aggrandizing oneself. And it's, the thing about narcissism is that these individuals will often appear highly charismatic. They can be very convincing. They can even be people that seem fun to be around in a sense. They tend to be very dominant, highly confident. So when you have a poor sense of self, this is why people can be attracted to these narcissists, because they seem like they have this confidence that you're seeking, but it's all kind of a show like a peacock. Because this grandiosity serves as a defense against this underlying vulnerability and shame. Okay, so let's go into the second type. Harder to detect, but probably just as common, which is the vulnerable or otherwise known as fragile narcissism, which looks very different to this grandiose narcissism, because instead of appearing dominant or confident, this person appears insecure, also sensitive to criticism. They may be a bit more socially withdrawn. They're resentful of others' successes, which is a key point, and they tend to be easily humiliated. So they tend to oscillate between feelings of inadequacy and then these fantasies of being exceptional or misunderstood, like I am deserving of, they basically feel deserving of things in the world that they actually haven't achieved, or I could be better than this person, or I know better than this person, but they're not really kind of doing things that kind of put themselves out there. And because this presentation lacks that kind of obvious sign of grandiosity, it's often overlooked. So I just want to point that out, because I think we're very good at assessing people who have the traits of the grandiose narcissism, but the more vulnerable, fragile narcissism, which is a feeling of inadequacy, but then the fantasy that if I did it like that person, I would be so much better, or I have so much more knowledge than that person, but yet they're not kind of putting themselves out there. There's a fantasy of being exceptional, while underneath there's a feeling of inadequacy, and that person is often more shy. But deep underneath, they're both driven by that core underlying sense of shame. And it's really important to understand that not everyone who has these traits or adaptations has a personality disorder, because again, remember, there's narcissistic defenses, traits that come up when you're challenged, when you're emotionally triggered. There's a personality style, which means you have personality traits that are kind of organized around that. And then there's a personality disorder, which is more pervasive across relationships, and which is associated with that kind of relational impairment where the person is very rigid and inflexible. So many people show narcissistic traits such as ambition, desire for recognition, or even a need for validation, for example, without it being this pathological personality structure. And I think that's a distinction that often gets missed in pop spirituality. Everyone just gets thrown into, this person has NPD, the narcissistic person, right? And I think it's very important to make that distinction, because unless we make that distinction, we can't actually acknowledge it within ourselves. And many narcissistic individuals function very well in their career, in leadership positions. They can be very creative, high achievers, and the difficulties will tend to appear most clearly in their intimate relationships and their internal emotional life. That's where the issues become most visible. So this idea of diagnosing people based on how they appear online is literally impossible, because you don't know how they're functioning in relationship and you don't know their internal emotional life. So I think that's really important to understand, because, the persona that we develop, that we put ourselves out there with, many of it has narcissistic traits, a desire for admiration, a desire for validation. But until you actually know that person and how they're functioning in their relationships and what their internal emotional life is like, you don't actually have any idea what's going on. So let's go into the psychospiritual dimension from the depth psychological perspective. And now we're going to get into Robert Moore's work, which is the dragon of grandiosity. And so at this point, it's really important to note that this is adding an archetypal dimension to the psychological picture that we just painted. So we covered the psychological lens of narcissism, but now let's look at it from the depth psychological perspective, which brings in Jung's core theory of what he called archetypal possession. Because a psychoanalytic point of view focuses on trauma, attachment wounds, the development of these defensive patterns. But Moore expands on this by arguing that grandiosity is not only a psychological defense, it is also connected to powerful archetypal energies that can overwhelm the ego. And he uses the image of a dragon to describe this force within the psyche. So the dragon symbolizes the part of us that wants to feel powerful, above ordinary human limitations, extraordinary. It is the impulse that longs to feel special, superior, wise. And in Moore's framework, psychological maturity requires facing this dragon. This means becoming conscious of these grandiose energies rather than unconsciously acting them out, repressing them, or projecting them on others. And I want to highlight that point, because there's three ways the dragon of grandiosity shows itself in our lives. Either we unconsciously act them out in this obvious way that we kind of outlined in the psychological dimension, or we repress them, or we project them onto others. So
we call others constantly grandiose and narcissists.
People are constantly talking about others and how narcissistic they are, or they can actually idealize others and see these narcissistic individuals as something to emulate. They ended up in these kind of guru worship relationships as well.
Real quick, so it's interesting with more what he's basically saying from the transpersonal psychological lens. The dragon grandiosity, this archetypal possession, is not just based on what we just discovered through childhood wounding and all of this. That can affect anyone, even with a healthy childhood, finally getting possessed by this archetype of grandiosity.
Exactly. So, the key idea is the dragon, as he calls it, symbolizes how these grandiose energies manifest within the psyche when we identify with the self, the greater self. We identify with God, essentially. So it creates an impulse to feel special, chosen, superior, all-knowing, exempt from limitations. And facing the dragon means being aware of one's capacity for grandiosity, which he says we all have, refusing to act it out unconsciously, not repressing it or projecting it onto others. So this is the point where trauma defenses tip into what he calls archetypal inflation, or what the Jungian calls archetypal inflation. So inflation occurs when the ego, the personal self, begins identifying with forces larger than itself. So instead of simply having connection to insight, the person begins to see these qualities as proof that they're uniquely special or awakened. So it's very tricky because every spiritual teacher will talk about how the ego loves to hijack spiritual experiences. So if you have a powerful spiritual experience of God or whatever, the ego will come in and say, I'm special. I'm a starseed. I need to lead others. God chose me. These kind of thoughts, right? And it's almost automatic because the I loves to take ownership for things. So this is when something transpersonal is absorbed into the personal self. So the ego no longer relates to these powerful spiritual experiences with humility. It claims that it's a unique arbitrator of it. God chose me for this. And this is when narcissism takes on this more dangerous form, when the archetypal energy becomes fused with the personality, creating a sense of I'm exceptional, I'm special. And yes, we're all special in our own way, but that doesn't mean you're superior to others. So this is when inflation becomes identified, or a person becomes inflated by becoming identified with the archetypal power. So this is when people believe they're special, chosen, uniquely entrusted as this knower of truth. And, the common kind of things they'll say is like, I'm more evolved than others. I have access to special truths that others can't see. My realizations place me in a category above ordinary people. I'm here for a special mission. And over time, this inflation tends to disconnect the person from important psychological traits like humility, the ability to be grounded in reality, the ability to know one's limitations, the ability to even ask for help, and most importantly, genuine mutual relationship with others. Very similar to the psychological form of narcissism, it's not possible anymore.
So some people may be familiar with Robert Moore's work. He has developed these 4 archetypes of the king, warrior, magician, and lover, right? For both king, queen, male, female. And he mapped this grandiosity through these 4 archetypes, which kind of helps to show how narcissism doesn't always look the same, right? So the royal narcissism, so to speak, or grandiosity, shows itself through authority, control, and idealization. It's domination disguised as benevolence or leadership, like wanting to control others, basically. Grandiosity can show up in the warrior archetype. Then when it shows through crusading energies, aggression, self-righteousness, and mission to save the world and all of this, right? It most often acts without empathy because it's all about defending the truth, right? And being the warrior identified with only the good side and projecting all the dark evil out externally. Grandiosity in the magician archetype manifests as detachment, abstraction of being above it all, called superiority, or, what Monroe called the new age of like, oh, there's no evil, or ignoring evil, or evil doesn't exist, or the non-duality, philosophical bypass, and all of this, right? And we'll talk about this more specifically also in the second hour when we go deep into this type of spiritual narcissism. And then the grandiosity in the lover archetype. That's when it manifests through emotional indulgent or indulgent in passions, victimhood, or identification with pain, right? The whole emotional body. Now, important to note that grandiosity does not always look flashy, right? Sometimes it shows up as a collapse, anxiety, despair, coldness, or aimlessness, similar to what Laura just talked about, these two sides of narcissism. It can also be very self-diminishment. But when impossible grandiose expectations that one has of oneself cannot be lived, the psyche then may swing from inflation into deflation, right?
So that's that vulnerable narcissist that we just talked about.
Exactly. So ultimately, it's both centers around being like overly concerned with self. It's all about the self, either poor me or, putting yourself down, or I'm grandiose and better than others, the other extreme. Two sides of the same narcissism coin or grandiosity coin, so to speak. Now, let's look into, obviously narcissism is an obstacle to awakening. It's a big distraction trap, so to speak, and every seeker will have to face it at some level. It even ties into the Luciferic temptation later on the path, which we'll also have talked about in the past, and we'll talk about it more. But it's important to see that narcissism blocks this condition required for awakening, for obvious reasons, because real awakening to one's true self with capital S requires humility, the ability to self-reflect, integrates one's shadow, and especially undesirable qualities, which we tend to project and only see in others, without collapsing, without falling into shame or feeling bad about yourself, but have compassion for both oneself and others, and relate and surrender to the larger transpersonal spiritual forces without thinking that one is the unique source of these spiritual forces. But narcissism blocks all of these. The grandiose ego cannot tolerate being wrong. Shadow work specifically threatens the false, idealized version of oneself, right? Because it feels so good about projecting it onto others. And when empathy is underdeveloped, as it is in all narcissistic types, so is compassion as well. And to the narcissist, surrender feels very humiliating or annihilating. It's really can feel like death and physical pain. So true humility is not about wearing modest clothes or sounding spiritual or saying the right things. It is knowing one's limitations and getting the help one needs when you need it. That's what Robert Moore pointed out.
Exactly.
Very important. And we can see this maybe in yourself, or most people have very hard time asking for help. Right?
Yeah.
And knowing your limitations.
Which is a shame-based thing. Like, I can do everything myself. I should have already been healed, or I'm above this.
Yes, exactly. So obviously we are currently in an epidemic of narcissism. The whole society amplifies narcissistic tendencies. It's where I like to say narcissistic pathologies has become normalized. We see it in social media validation, influencer culture, the idea of becoming a brand, so to speak, the attention economy, all reward representing an idealized false self on social media, right? Once that enters spiritual culture, the awakening itself becomes something to brand, market, display, and perform rather than truly live, so to speak. And at the core again, a lot of spiritual searching is real, based on real pain and real wounding, and many people seek spiritually sincerely as a way to heal. So the search begins, maybe sincerely from pain and the real desire for truth or relief and integration. But this is also where the danger then begins, or the temptation, so to speak. If those emotional wounds are not consciously processed, then obviously spirituality can become a way of escaping pain, spiritually bypassing it, rather than facing it, and is here then when the spiritualized ego develop. And now spirituality becomes a new identity for the false self, then the path of healing. Again, we call this spiritual bypassing, and spiritual narcissism rests in this. So you see this in the New Age when people identify themselves, I'm an awakened starseed, I'm a wanderer, I'm an indigo child, or I'm a reborn Christian now. I am, in this neo-Christian revival, which we've talked about as well. This identification. Both carry this type of spiritual narcissism. But the birth of spiritual narcissism is really when the wounded self attaches to a new spiritual identity. That's a key point. And that's when also we mistake then the spiritualized ego for the true self. And that is the biggest deception of all. Not to be able to differentiate, hey, what is actually the false ego personality that has hijacked the process versus the true self that is being buried behind. So the person then becomes identified with being awakened, being a healer, being chosen, being a teacher, being more conscious, or having special access to truth. And then the spiritual identity becomes the new self. Instead of using spirituality for healing, spirituality is actually used to avoid it, but the person is not aware of it. And with that being said, we will dive deeper now into this topic of spiritual narcissism in part 2.
Okay, so just to recap a little bit what we're going to get into part 2. So again, if you're not a member, you can go to veilofreality.com/membership and sign up for the second hour of every single podcast. We're going to go into this idea of the dragon in more depth. What is the dragon? How is it in all of us? How can we work with it? How does this relate to the Lucifer complex when the ego identifies with the self? How is tribalism a defense against grandiosity? How do we outsource the dragon by joining groups that say we're the special ones, we're the chosen ones, we're more enlightened, we're the saved ones? Very fascinating how we can actually displace our personal grandiosity onto a collective identity like a political tribe, a religion, a spiritual community, whatever. And then we're going to talk more about this spiritual narcissism, how the dragon can present itself in spiritual ideas, language, and practice, and adopts a spiritual identity. We're going to talk about how that links with spiritual bypassing and how people avoid the actual work of processing their emotional wounds. We're going to give you some practical guidance from Terry Real's map, this one up, one down dynamic, which is a way that we kind of basically every single person will tend to organize their relationships around hierarchy. You're either better than or worse than. How can we work with that? And then we're going to talk about Robert Mora's antidotes to facing the dragon. A little condensed version. You can actually read his book, Facing Personal and Collective Grandiosity, if you'd like to learn more, and the signs of spiritual maturity. So thank you so much for listening, and see you in the second hour.